Hey guys, Cookie here for Swanee Plays Games. The gigantic patch that we've been waiting for about a month has finally arrived, and I gotta say, there is a lot to go over. So I'm going to go over every single piece of this patch from top to bottom, including the explanations given by Johan Paulstedt, the Chief Creative Officer, and give you guys as much information as I possibly can. So I'm going to go through every single part of the patch, so let's just jump right on into it. First of all, this is patch 01.000.400. Says Freedom's greetings, Helldivers. I'm your host, Release Captain Kalberg, bringing you democracy's latest and greatest from super superior minds. It's a lot of information, so let's dive in. Alright, so first off in the overview, it talks about how the major areas of interest are the visible supply lines and attack origins in the Galactic War, stratagem, weapon, planet, and enemy balancing updates, crash fixes, stability improvements, and also the invite-only lobby creation. It says that the rightmost option in the lobby settings, currently only localized in English, additional languages coming in the next patch. Then it says balancing, and then says the goal was stratagem balance changes in this patch. With these balance changes, we wanted to buff up some of the weaker stratagems to make them more viable and add more possibility for variety in the loadouts. We also changed a few to make them more consistent, but the goal was to keep a similar or higher power level. We are looking into the stratagems more to see if there are any other stratagems that might need some buffs or changes to make them more viable. We also want to be better at explaining what our goals are with the changes. Please see the linked blog post for more information. And that linked blog post is what I'm going to be getting all the definitions and the explanations for why they did the changes that they did. And I will read those for you guys as well. So first off, we've got the AMLS 4X Rocket Sentry. A lot of changes were made to this stratagem. Decreased spread, prioritized larger targets, increased target distance from 75 to 100 meters, decreased rockets per salvo from 2 to 1 to get a better ammo economy, increased the explosion radius from 1 to 4 meters, decreased explosion armor penetration, as in explosion can no longer damage heavy armored enemies. The projectile still has enough AP to damage heavily armored targets, and overall increased the projectile damage from 200 to 300. The explanation for this said the old intent was to saturate an area with rockets, but made it too inconsistent against medium and larger enemies. They said they wanted to make it more consistent against those medium and larger enemies and give it a better ammo economy to separate it from the autocannon sentry that has a higher damage output, but can waste ammo by shooting targets that are already dead. On to the next is the AMG-43 machine gun sentry, which just had its cooldown reduced from 180 seconds to 120. The explanation for this said that the machine gun sentry felt like a worse version of the Gatling sentry, and we wanted it to have a different place in the toolbox. We lowered the cooldown to make it more available and more useful when changing position often. Then there's a bunch of stratagems that get the same change here. This is the machine gun sentry, Gatling sentry, rocket sentry, autocannon sentry, mortar sentry, and the EMS mortar sentry, otherwise known as all the sentries, that got its durability increased from 0% to 80%. The explanation for this says that the sentry turrets in the game were a little too easily killed by the bullets flying in a chaotic situation. They've increased the durability factor of the turrets to make them more resistant to small arms fire. I'm a big fan of this change personally. They also changed the EMG 101 HMG emplacement, increasing the rotation speed by 100%. Explanation says that the HMG emplacement is intended to be a way of defending a fixed position, but due to its immobility and the drawback that presents, the slow rotation speed was a bit too much of an additional drawback. Therefore, they've increased the rotation speed significantly. On to some changes to the mines. They've changed the explosion damage for both the anti-personnel minefield and the incendiary mines, changing the explosion damage on the anti-personnel from 250 to 350, and increasing the explosion damage on the incendiaries from 150 to 210. The explanation for this was that the minefields are supposed to be a strong but volatile way of blocking off certain approaches for a limited time. They are currently not very good at filling this role, and we'll be looking more at them in the future. For now, we're increasing the damage, at least to improve their effectiveness against targets that trigger them. On to the orbital Gatling, a bunch of changes to this one. They increased the fire rate by 25%, increased the rounds per salvo from 30 to 60, they increased the armor penetration, and they decreased the cooldown from 80 seconds to 70 seconds. The explanation behind this says the orbital Gatling barrage was not effective at dealing with any specific targets. We wanted to be better at saturating the target area and also be able to do damage against heavily armored units. It is still not very likely to outright kill heavily armored targets, but should be able to soften them up a bit. We also lowered the cooldown to make it more available and to make it more competitive in comparison to Eagle stratagems. Then the orbital precision strike got its cooldown decreased from 100 to 90 seconds, and they decreased the spawn/call-in time from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. The orbital precision strike's original attempt was to be used against spawners and fixed position. However, this hasn't stopped the community from using it against pretty much everything. Therefore, we want to make it a little easier easier to use against moving targets by lowering the call-in time. We also lower the cooldown to make it more available and to make it more competitive, again in comparison with the Eagle Stratagems. The Orbital Airburst Strike got its cooldown decreased from 120 to just 100 seconds. The explanation behind this said the Orbital Airburst's original intent was to block an area for a short duration and kill most of the non-heavy armored enemies in the area. It was underperforming compared to other anti-chaff options and had a very low rate of use. To make it a more attractive option, we lowered the cooldown, which also should again make it more competitive with comparison to Eagle Stratagems. So overall, Orbital Strike's not getting used obviously as often as the Eagle one, so they clearly wanted to make that more of an even comparison. That being said, there are some changes to some of the Eagle Strikes as well. The Eagle 110mm rocket pods. While these changes may look like a straight up nerf, that is not the intention. Please see the blog post, which I'll read here in just a second. They improved the targeting, they increased the projectile armor penetration, now does 100% damage to heavily armored enemies instead of 50%, but they decreased the projectile damage from 600 to 250 to compensate for the improved targeting and the extra damage from the increased armor penetration. They also decreased the explosive armor penetration. Explosion can no longer damage heavily armored enemies. So the explanation for this one says the Eagle rocket pods were very inconsistent in dealing with its main targets, heavily armored enemies. The changes we are making aim to make it more consistent at dealing with these targets, but it will still not be a surefire way of outright killing them. It should, however, always soften up a target in some way. We are interested in hearing feedback on how this feels now and are open to tweaking them further. So this one kind of seems like a work in progress. They also changed the Eagle strafing run, increasing its uses from 3 to 4 and increasing its armor penetration so it can now damage heavily armored enemies. In the blog post it says the Eagle strafing run is supposed to be a tool to effectively deal with small groups of medium armored enemies. To that end, they have increased its armor penetration to be able to reliably penetrate medium armored targets and soften up heavily armored enemies. They said that we expect to have to tweak this further in the future. As with the Eagle rocket pods, we are very interested in your feedback. So again, quite a work in progress there on the Eagle Stratagems. The GL-21 grenade launcher has gotten its explosion damage increased from 350 to 400. They said the grenade launcher is intended to be good at softening up hordes of enemies and provide utility for destroying spawners. While it is still good at destroying spawners, the explosion was a little too weak to reliably damage medium enemies. The change in its explosion damage should be put in a better place when it comes to dealing with hordes and more effective against some medium armored enemies. Next up, a bunch of changes to the MG206 heavy machine gun. They've increased the projectile damage from 100 to 150. They've also increased the damage against durable body parts from 23 to 33%. Decreased the fire rate though from 450, 750, 900 to 450, 600, and 750. And they've decreased the reload time from 7 to 5.5 seconds, which is a pretty big deal, and increased the stagger strength. The blog post about it says the HMG failed to deliver on the fantasy of a heavy machine gun when it was released. It had a weak round with low damage and impact, and while the fire rate was up in levels more likely seen on smaller machine guns, the HMG's intent is to be a great option at dealing with medium armored enemies and should chew them up easily, similar to the HMG emplacement. We are lowering the rate of fire further to resemble the fire rate seen in contemporary weapons of similar type, and increasing the damage and stagger so that each hit is significant. This should also make the available ammo last longer. Next up is the MG43 machine gun. They decreased the reload time from 4 to 3.5 seconds and increased the maximum amount of magazines from 3 to 4. They said the intent of the machine gun was that it should be a great crowd clear weapon with the ability to tackle medium armored enemies. The drawbacks of the machine gun are that you have to sit still while reloading, and this made it hard to compete with the stalwart's mobility. Therefore, we want to lean into its strengths and reduce its drawbacks slightly to improve the value proposition of the weapon. To that end, we are lowering the reload time and giving it an additional magazine. It is also receiving a buff to the damage described below. Okay, so this is another big change that applies to a couple of different stratagems, including the machine gun sentry, Gatling sentry, and the XO45 Patriot exosuits Gatling. It increased the projectile damage of all of that from 80 to 90 and increased the projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5% to 25%. The explanation on this just said the family of machine gun stratagems that use the 8mm rifle round were underperforming slightly, and we have therefore increased the damage slightly. So before I get into the next stratagems and what got changed about them, there is this part of the blog post that kind of covers a bunch of different stratagems and why they changed this one certain part in all of them. It talks about the durable damage for rifle calibers. Small arms fire in the game does less damage to durable body parts. However, many small arms were doing the same damage percentage-wise, not representing the larger impact a rifle type round would have compared to other types. Therefore, rifle type bullets are now slightly more effective against durable body parts. So here's all the guns that are affected by that: the AR-23 Liberator, the M105 Stalwart, the Guard Dog, the Liberator Concussive, the Diligence, the Adjudicator, the Tenderizer, the Machine Gun Sentry, Gatling Sentry, and again the Exosuits Gatling. As you may have noticed, that durable, every time it's been mentioned, has had an asterisk next to it. The asterisk says that the durable body parts are in general body parts that have a high amount of mass with non-vital organs or a lot of empty space. The idea is to simulate that a single bullet has a high chance of not dealing significant damage. In general, the higher your caliber of weapon, the better the effect is against durable body parts. Explosions also have very high effectiveness against durable body parts, as shockwaves ripple through whatever you are hitting, and some weapons are more effective than others or have special exceptions, though this should follow the same logic as above. Alright, so let's continue to go through all of these. You see the AR-23 Liberator, Stalwart, and the Guard Dog have their increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 10 to 23%. The Liberator Concussive also has the same thing, changed from 23 to 35%. And then there's the Adjudicator, which has an increased magazine capacity from 25 to 30, again with the durable body parts projectile damage going from 10 to 20%. And then there's an explanation for this one saying the Adjudicator, with relatively few rounds in each magazine combined with a wild recoil, left players no room for arrow, which didn't feel good for an assault rifle type weapon. The increased magazine capacity should make the weapon more forgiving of mistakes and encourage a more aggressive playstyle. Remember, short, controlled bursts. Then the Tenderizer, the AR-61 Tenderizer, got a lot of changes. Increased projectile damage from 60 to 95 against durable body parts from 10 to 17%. Decreased, though, the ammo capacity from 35 to 30, and decreased the number of magazines from 10 to 8. Increased the stagger strength as well. The Tenderizer was released in a non-representative state as it used the incorrect stats, didn't have its own niche, and felt like a worse Liberator. We're restoring justice and bringing it back to its intended design, which is a very precise assault rifle that rewards high accuracy play by having a heavy-hitting round that doesn't penetrate medium armor. Yeah, so the Tenderizer basically came out in the completely wrong direction they wanted it to, so I guess that's been amended now. Then the Plaz 101 Purifier increased the projectile armor penetration to be the same as the explosion and decrease the explosion damage fall off. The explanation here says the original idea behind the Purifier was to create a Scorcher variant with a charge up mechanic. Unfortunately, since the projectile didn't have enough armor penetration against medium armor enemies, even a direct hit didn't deal enough damage to justify its long charge up time. By increasing the armor penetration of the projectile and reducing the damage fall off of the explosion, we hope to make it an exotic option that is viable in capable hands. Then the crossbow has kind of gotten the change right back. The CB9 explosive crossbow got its explosion armor penetration to be the same as the projectile. They increased the demolition strength so it now can destroy bug holes and bot fabricator buildings, and they added a medium penetration tag. Explanation for this one said similarly to the Purifier, the crossbow's bolt didn't always deal its full damage due to their explosion having lower armor penetration than the projectile. Making both the projectile and the explosion penetrate medium armor should make the crossbow more consistent against medium-sized targets and increase its AoE viability. It'll be interesting to see if the crossbow is better now than when it first came out, or if it's got to be better than it was at least after the nerf. So the R36 Eruptor got a big buff from having its increased total damage from 420 to 570 damage per shot. And this has a pretty lengthy explanation. It says, in one of the previous patches, we removed the shrapnel from the explosion as it made the Eruptor's ability to spike damage too much for a primary weapon, and for a support weapon, even its theoretical max was over 9,000, and introduced some unexpected interactions. We acknowledge that the Eruptor lost a good portion of its capabilities, and the additional damage boost didn't make up for the loss of shrapnel. Adding back shrapnel is quite tricky because of the low visibility of shrapnel, which sometimes created situations where you or your fellow Helldivers died with very little feedback of what killed you. To compensate for that, we're giving the Eruptor 150 more damage per explosion to make it more consistent without introducing new edge cases. The intent is that this change will make the Eruptor viable both against medium armored targets and groups of cannon fodder enemies. Also, the R63 Diligence got an increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 10 to 25%. 15%. And the last thing it says under balancing is other here. It says updated recoil stance modifiers. We made changes to the recoil stance modifiers to make them more consistent and also reward being prone more. Almost all of them will improve the recoil, and only 2 have been made worse, and only by 10%. The explanation behind this is kind of lengthy. It says that the updated recoil stance modifiers, the intention of our recoil modifiers is to reward uses of different stances in relation to different weapon types. They're also there to highlight that constantly moving around isn't doing your accuracy any favors. We made some changes to the recoil stance modifiers to make them more consistent and also reward being prone more, like they already said. This little chart shows that the percentages below show how much of the weapon's recoil was applied in different scenarios. There was no change to the third-person stand. The crouch, though, got an increase from 50 to 60% stationary and a decrease from 125 to 100% moving. And also the stationary while prone went from 50% to 40%. And then the scoped, the stand went down 100 to 90, went up for moving from 100 to 110. For the crouch, went down from 75 to 60 and down and moving from 125 to 90. And in prone stationary from 50 to 40. They said hopefully this gives a little bit more insight on how we think and why we have made the changes we did. I want to end this by saying that we are not done. We will continue to refine and improve the play experience to keep the game fresh. On behalf of the team, we appreciate your feedback and hope that you'll have an exciting time checking these adjustments out. That concludes the blog post, as it only covered like the stratagems and stuff like that. As for everything else, let's keep going because there's plenty more to go in these patch notes, but I'm going to get you through it all. So let's head into gameplay. In general, it says to remove the operation modifier AA defenses, reducing the stratagem slots by 1. We want to look over the operation modifiers in the future. Right now there are too few of them, which become repetitive, and the ones we have do not create variety or promote different play styles. For now, we remove this one because it only encourages the players to bring the best stratagems and does not promote variety. This is one thing I'm definitely in favor of. So basically, the whole idea of reducing the stratagem slots by 1, which happened on, I think, just mainly automaton planets at high difficulties, that's gone. So that's great for me. Personally, love that change. They disabled the Retrieve Essential Personnel Defend Event mission for the time being. This is to give the mission the proper attention and care that it deserves, as it is now deemed not fun enough or performing as we want it to. So it's interesting to see the retrieving essential personnel being completely taken out of the game, as that has just been messed up since launch. So that might be the best thing they can do right now, because they have not managed to fix that yet. So Super Samples now spawn on difficulty 6. The reason for this change is that we feel that their existence only on difficulty 7+ forced some players to play the game on a harder difficulty than they wanted to comfortably play on. We do, however, still want a gating of them, but a less punishing one. The SEAF artillery stratagem is no longer blocked by stratagem jammers or ion storms and is available after the mission timer ends and the destroyer leaves close orbit. So that's a pretty big change. So if you actually manage to get to the minor objective of the SEAF artillery, you no longer would be blocked by anything that didn't make sense to block in the first place. So that's a pretty cool change. The enemies in melee range of the gates and the evacuate high value assets missions will now attack it more consistently. They added the ability to chat from in-game menus and the mission loading screen, and they updated some first-person crosshairs to improve readability. It says invite-only lobbies are now supported, as I kind of said earlier on in the patch notes. There is also a new armor passive, Peak Physique. It'll increase your melee damage by 50% and increase your weapon ergonomics by 30%. There are a bunch of changes to planets and hazards. First off, the spike plant. The spike plant that appears on certain planets has been reworked. It no longer causes bleed or stamina drain if hit by the plant explosion or spikes, and it now pops 3 times, sending spikes everywhere, dealing increased damage. So that's definitely going to be something to look out for. The fire tornadoes have had their behavior changed. They should no longer feel like they actively respond to player movement and should move more randomly. While a fire tornado storm takes place, enemy vision is reduced, player vision is unaffected. It also says the fire tornadoes being more random should result in more variance in situations players find themselves in. Tornadoes are significantly less likely to pile up and overlap on extraction points or objectives, and will generally be a bit easier to deal with. That's probably a good change. On to the tremors. Says tremors have had their spawning tweaked to be slightly more random and have had their epicenter size and effect range increased. These changes should result in more situations where enemies away from the player get stunned as well. These changes should result in more situations where enemies away from the player get stunned, as well as reducing how consistently the player has a tremor occur next to them. And then ion storms have added additional VFX. Some changes to visibility. A lot of planets have had their fog amounts tweaked to be a bit less harsh and dense to provide less less fatigue from constantly fighting on planets with bad visibility. We still intend there to be foggy planets with worse visibility, but the balance was a bit off. So desert planets such as Arata Prime, Chort Bay, Hellmire, and others, highland planets such as Verilia 5, Matar Bay, Ashaune, and similar, and artificial light sources have had their intensity rebalanced and reduced across the board to fix situations of lights completely blinding the player. Love all of those changes. Unexploded hell bombs. The unexploded malfunctioning hell bombs that can sometimes be found on planets will now explode immediately. If hit with strong explosions or heavy weaponry, they will still have the same delay if hit by small arm fire or weaker attacks. Vegetation that's large enough to slow the player now has an extra function. When inside the vegetation, Helldivers will be harder to detect, reducing their detection range by enemies. This effect stacks with other detection reducing effects such as nighttime, being crouched or prone, or things such as the scout armor passive. Now a few changes to the enemies, starting with the acid effect. The acid effect applied by hunters, bug mines, etc. now allows you to sprint while under the effect and slows you by 30% instead of 50%. Duration has been increased from 3 to 4 seconds, and these changes are intended to make it less punishing for players to be slowed while fighting the Terminids. This allows us to use it in more places without making the experience very punishing, for example, the Bile Spewers. Armored enemy balance. We've toned down the amount of heavily armored enemies like Bile Titans, Chargers on higher difficulties, and instead spawn more hordes of smaller enemies. The difference should be quite noticeable, and the amount should be at least 30% less than before during bug breaches. We've also toned down slightly how many hulks that spawn for the automatons. Our intent is to ease up on the demand for anti-tank weapons, and by having more of the other enemies give a better incentive for the group to bring stratagems and weapons that take care of hordes. The patrols. The patrol spawning is now back to how it worked before the patch 1.00.300 with some slight tweaks so that the levels are less empty if you are far away from important locations with enemy presence. So that's the big change everybody's been waiting for, the patrols to be taken down to the original levels that the game came out with, and it looks like that's exactly what should happen here. Stunning. Medium and large sized enemies now don't get stunned as easily. This will not affect the stratagems that stun and will mostly just affect how easily the pummeler can stun larger enemies. Terminids. The Bile Spewer and Nursing Spewer. So again, the Spewers will now get slowed if they lose their legs. Spewer Puke now applies the acid effect, but Spewer Puke now can only damage Helldivers up to 4 times per second, and the Helldiver cannot take damage multiple times from the same projectile. This should reduce instances where you are instantly killed by it. So they're kind of trying to rework the Spewers again, as they are still quite powerful and people get one shot all the time. The Bile Titan. The Bile Titan's head is slightly less durable against weaker anti-tank weapons. It's not a large change, will mostly matter for weapons like the railgun. The Bile Titan's Puke can now only damage the Helldiver 4 times per second, just like the Spewers, and the Helldiver cannot take damage multiple times from the same projectile. The damage is still very deadly, so running through the Puke is not recommended. Their Puke now also has a bigger spread. The Charger Behemoth is now joining the battle on higher difficulties. It can now also take more damage than before. This enables us to spawn fewer Chargers but still retain the difficulty. So you've probably seen Charger Behemoths every once in a while. I've usually seen them on the Essential Personnel missions. I see one every once in a while, so it'll be interesting to see how much more difficult they are to get rid of. They didn't seem that much more, but like they said, they have given them a bit of a buff in this patch. Chargers. They will now only show bleed out effects from the body if the bleed out state has started. It can still show bleed out effects from the mouth without having started the bleed out state. Hulk's Scorchers under Automaton says the Hulk's flamethrower now does less damage and cannot damage Helldivers more than 4 times per second. In addition, the Helldiver cannot be damaged multiple times by the same flame projectile. This should reduce instances where you are instantly killed by it. That all sounds good to me. And the Automaton tank has a couple of changes. The tank armor value on the front has been lowered to be the same as the non-vent sections on the rear of the tank. The intent was initially that it was supposed to be more armored in the front, but the visual language did not show that. The vents on the back of the tank's turrets still has the same armor value as before, but we'll check for explosion directions correctly now. And the damage of exploding automaton jump packs has been decreased by 50%. It will still set you on fire though. On to the Galactic War. So they are now introducing supply lines and origin of attacks. Supply lines were previously not shown on the Galactic War map to reduce clutter and improve readability. However, based on the feedback from our community, we have made an implementation showing them on the map. This solution tries to maintain the general readability while still exposing the system to players in game. You will now also be able to see which planet an attack is originating from, potentially allowing for the community to stop the attack at its source. We also have updated visuals in the sector and planet info pop-ups. So this is of course something people have been asking for a long time, so there shouldn't be any more need for Reddit to tell people where to attack and where to defend. It should be more obvious on the map without needing all that community interaction. There are a ton of fixes here. The first one to go over is the FAF-14 Spear. I'm waiting for this one for a while. The spear targeting has been reworked and should now function much better. However, it has lost the ability to target automaton spawners. This is not intended and will be fixed in the future. It'll be interesting to see how it's really been reworked because they don't really go into details about that, but it should function a lot better. And it is interesting though that you can no longer shoot spawners even though they didn't mean for that to happen. It does sound like the spear is just causing them quite a lot of headaches and apparently is a very difficult stratagem to fix. So I'll have to see how that plays out. So there are a ton of fixes here. I'm not going to go over every single one for the purpose of this video. It has been quite a bit of information for you guys already, but I will have it available on screen for you to look at, so you can always pause the video to see each individual fix. There is quite a lot of them, so I would actually probably recommend that you look through these, but that will be available here, and of course the link to the patch notes will be in the description, so you can always read them there if you would prefer. Also show some crash fixes. I'll throw those on the screen real quick. Always good to get as many crash fixes as possible into the game. And as always, there are known issues, although I will say I think this known issues seems significantly smaller than it usually is, so that's a good sign. If you want to take a look at that, that will be available to you on screen. All right, guys, so that was a ton to go through. There is a lot of buffs in this patch. I don't know if there was barely any nerfs at all, so there definitely shouldn't be too much complaining about there being too many nerfs in this one. I personally love the fact that they are giving this an attempt. We'll have to see what it looks like in the game itself, but this is pretty cool. I'm a big fan of almost all of these changes, and I'm very curious to see what impact it has on the game. I'm also kind of out of breath because I've been reading quite a lot, so I hope you guys got a full information on this patch and got all the information you need. But that's going to do it for me. If you feel like you've been fully informed, please give us a like. It helps us out a lot in the algorithm and everything like that. If you have any thoughts on this patch specifically, please let us know in the comments section down below. There's plenty to have thoughts on. And if you're new here or want to keep getting updates on videos just like this one for Helldivers, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. But that's going to do it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.